Welcome back to Cinephiles, I'm Rod Richards. Today I'm going to talk about Breaker Morant, which is an Australian film from 1980 directed by Bruce Beresford. Breaker Morant is based on the true story of Harry Morant, played by the English actor Edward Woodward, who was a lieutenant in the British colonial army serving in the Second Boer War in what is now called South Africa, and who was court-martialed and executed along with a few others for what we would now call war crimes. This Harry Morant was a very interesting guy. He was born in England but moved to Australia at age 19, and he was known as both a highly skilled horsebreaker, hence the name of the film, and a bush balladeer, which is a genre of poetry that was popular back then in Australia. Okay, so let's go into a little bit of background for this film so it will make more sense. The Second Boer War lasted from 1899 to 1902, and this war was complicated. But in a nutshell, it was a campaign by the British to take control of southern Africa from the other large groups of white people who had colonized that particular area. And this other group was broadly called the Boers, and Boer is simply a Dutch word for farmer. Now, the Dutch had had a large presence in southern Africa since the 1600s, but by the time of the Boer Wars, there were really two distinct groups of Dutch descendants in this area. There were the Cape Dutch, who lived around the Cape Town area and were mostly urbanized types. And then you had the Boers, who were people who had fled the Cape Town area in the 1830s into southern Africa's vast interior, mainly because they didn't want to live under the ever-increasing authority of the British. These Boers had a very different culture from the Cape Dutch. They were mostly semi-nomadic cattle herders who lived by the Old Testament, and like many herding people, they had an honor culture. And I don't mean honor in the sense that we usually use that word today, like my kid's on the honor roll. I mean honor in the ancient sense, as practiced by the Hatfields and the McCoys, for example. So as this conflict between the British and the Boers escalated, the British began facing increasing resistance from Boer commandos. Commando is actually a Boer word, which in turn comes from the Portuguese. And these commandos were groups of Boer guerrilla fighters who operated in autonomous units. And these guys were rough bastards. They lived off the land, they used hit-and-run tactics, and they answered only to themselves. They were definitely not the kind of men you'd want to face in combat if you had a choice. So the British, facing this asymmetrical war from a highly dedicated, highly mobile opponent, needed a way to counter these tactics. So they formed the Bushveld Carbineers, and this group would be an example of what we would now call special forces. They would also be highly mobile, highly trained, and they would fight fire with fire, so to speak. Specifically, the British. Now keep in mind that Australia was still under indirect control of the British back then. The British needed men who were great shots with a rifle, knew how to ride horses, and who could live off the land. Well, enter the Australians. Australia had a lot of folks living out in the sticks who were small farmers and herders. They were very experienced with horses, and they were known to be excellent shots. They had a lot of practice hunting kangaroos and other critters for food out in the bush. And although the Australians had a reputation for a lack of discipline, these were the kinds of guys they needed to fight the Boers. And that is why this unit of Bushveld Carbineers in Breaker Morant was mostly Australian. So as wars tend to do, the conflict escalated into increasingly morally questionable tactics on both sides. And the British were looking for a way to get out of this war, which was both politically unpopular and not going particularly well militarily either. And this brings us back to the narrative of this film, which centers around the court-martial of Captain Morant and two others. The main story is told as a progression of court proceedings, and the rest is provided as flashbacks. The drama in Breaker Morant concerns the things that tend to happen in wars that nobody likes to discuss openly. Things that don't look good when brought out into the open, not least because such discussions tend to lead to further uncomfortable questions that might implicate people in positions of power. The most striking thing about the film Breaker Morant is its realism, and director Bruce Beresford did a lot of research into this case and added a ton of historical details. And this had the effect of making the film feel less cinematic because, as we know, reality is often not cinematic, particularly the reality of over 100 years ago. And people don't always behave the way we've been conditioned by the movies to expect them to behave. One interesting example of this realism is that there is no musical score in this film. This was a deliberate decision by Bruce Beresford. In fact, he didn't use film scores in any of his work because he thought that music and cinema tended to evoke inauthentic emotions in the audience, and he didn't want that. Adding to this sense of realism that Beresford crafted is the way the characters are portrayed. The actions of the men on trial are portrayed without flinching. There's no attempt made to sanitize their behavior or to make heroes or villains out of them. Breaker Morant also gives non-Australians a bit of insight into how Australians see themselves. It's clear in this film that the Australians were regarded by the British with a certain amount of contempt. They were thought to be uneducated, unruly types, and in this film, the role of Peter Hancock in particular, played by Bryan Brown, who was also court-martialed alongside Morant, seems to represent Australianness in this sense. He's brash, he's a drinker and a brawler, he's a womanizer, and he's got a heart of gold. Breaker Morant was actually a pretty low-budget film, and though it looks like it was shot on location in the Transvaal region of South Africa, it was actually filmed in South Australia, in an area that looks almost just like the area where the film is set. Australia, being a former British colony, has a lot of abandoned farm buildings and a lot of artifacts of British colonial rule that are very similar to what you'd find in the Transvaal of South Africa. So this worked out really well for the film. There are some really beautiful shots of these wide open African, actually Australian landscapes. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Breaker Morant. Do check this film out and let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. Until next time.